Hey, HUMO soldiers. I am rebooting a true crime podcast I began long ago called Children of the Void. Children of the Void explores missing child cases and cases about children who were found murdered that are rife with suspicious conduct among the child's inner circle and unanswered questions regarding the potential perpetrator. I will be co-hosting the show with Bonnie Lee, who is also the host of Writing About Crime. The first few episodes of Children of the Void are still available on all download platforms, as well as on YouTube. The new episodes will be released in late November of 2022. Please subscribe and look out for the new releases. Thank you and enjoy the show. Welcome to Human Monsters. Of the 4 countries that form the United Kingdom, Scotland is undoubtedly one of the gems in the treasure chest of unforgettable and breathtaking landscapes. The cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh are decorated with intricate and astounding architecture that often dates back hundreds of years ago. Outside the metropolitan areas, rolling lush hills with ancient castles and homesteads dotting velvety green terrain with a view that is timeless in its beauty, is framed by tranquil lakes and breathtaking seascapes. It is here, in this uncut gem of the British Isles, that I discovered the case of a villain, frankly so fascinating and completely cold that to not tell you about his devious deeds would be a crime in itself. So pour yourself a shot of authentic Scottish whiskey, turn up the bagpipe music, and hold on to your kilt, because the story of Archibald Hall is unlike any other you have heard. This scoundrel was a psychopath and a serial killer, but not in the conventional way. He only began killing later in life, after his 50s, and he also killed people he had personal relationships with. Another interesting fact is that he used different methods of killing. But one thing is for sure, this cold-hearted killer had no compassion for mankind, and a burning desire to be as rich as the elegant and glamorous stars were who graced the screens in the films and variety shows he and his mother loved so passionately. He even chose Roy Fontaine as one of his many, but for sure, his favorite aliases. Why he decided on the name Roy is uncertain, but he chose Fontaine as his surname as an homage to Joan Fontaine, who starred in Suspicion and Rebecca by Alfred Hitchcock. He fancied himself an excellent jewel thief, but despite his antics being entertaining, he almost always was caught. His dapper dress sense and debonair flair for the finer things in life speaks of a confident man, and those who met him spoke of a sexual magnetism that he exuded. But this attractive swindler was no gentleman. He was also a con man and a liar. But here's an account of the life and times of the charming butler who conned and stole his way through high society. Archibald Thompson Hall, or Roy, as we will be referring to him from this point on, was never satisfied with his station in life, but he also had no desire to work for what he had. He was born in Glasgow to working-class parents, Mary, who changed her name to Marion, and Archibald Sr. on the 17th of July 1924. By all accounts, he had a comfortable life. His father is described as a good and hard-working man who held a position at the post office, and both parents appeared to be caring, especially his mother, who let him get away with anything. Roy, who was the firstborn, was 10 years old when his parents adopted a little girl named Violet. He doted on his little sister, and the two would get dressed up and visit the cinema together regularly. Afterwards, his brother Donald was born in 1938. Rumor has it that Archibald Sr. was not the father of Donald, and that Marion had had an affair with her husband's senior officer in the Army, which resulted in the last of the Hall siblings being born. It is also when he was 10 years old that he insisted on everyone calling him Roy. Roy's mother favored him, and she would spoil her eldest child. Marion was the more domineering of the parents, and Roy inherited her mood swings and discontent with his life. Roy loved the movies of the era and envied the lifestyles of the rich and famous. He wanted to be part of the glitz and glamour, surrounded by bejeweled ladies of social standing and men who had stature in society. He dreamed of having a life of unbridled wealth, but instead of following conventional ways of getting to his fortune, he decided from a very young age that stealing what you want is a much faster way of procuring what you desire. He began his career as a criminal very early, with reports that he was an unruly scholar with charges of stealing and vandalism beginning in his early teens. His first money-making scheme was to go from house to house with a collection tin, pretending to be part of the fundraising efforts of the Red Cross. His first arrest would be at the age of 13 years old for felonious mischief. At the age of 16, he met a woman named Anne Phillips, who owned a news agency. The two, despite Anne being twice his age, began a close friendship. Anne was undoubtedly grooming her new young friend, buying him gifts, and taking him out for meals, and soon the two were having a sexual relationship. His parents were not happy about the relationship, and when Anne bought Roy an expensive jacket, his father tried to force him to return the gift. His response was to threaten his father with a knife, until Archibald Sr. gave in and allowed him to keep it. Anne taught him how to be more refined, and from this point onwards, Roy would do anything to rid himself of the brash Scottish accent he had inherited, and thanks to Anne's poor bookkeeping, he was able to liberate goods and cash from her shop. The relationship ended when his family moved to a military base, after his father accepted a position in the Army. This time at the Army barracks was not without incident, and Roy could just not stay out of trouble. He would watch the routine of soldiers, break into their rooms when they are not there, and steal property. This all came to light when Roy managed to steal very confidential papers and was caught. When he was interviewed by the military police in his room, they discovered a shrine to Hitler. Roy claimed not to be a follower, but that he respected the mass murderer. The military was unimpressed by his long fingers and warped ideology, and the family was sent packing once again. At the age of 17, he wanted to look for greener pastures in the city of London. He funded an exorbitant lifestyle by robbing houses and befriending rich people he would meet in the nightclub scene. On the 14th of May, 1941, Roy was for the first time arrested and had to serve a sentence. He was caught forging checks and was given a 60-day sentence for the misdeed. From this point onwards, he would be in and out of prison so frequently that they should have had revolving doors installed for him. In August of the same year, he was once again stealing, and this time he had to serve jail time, and afterwards he was referred to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. At the hospital, he claimed to have no remorse about his crimes, and claimed to hear voices and have visual hallucinations. Doctors did not believe the latter, but Roy was not going to stick around for a diagnosis. He escaped, and, because the law stated that a patient was not found in 28 days, they were no longer a patient. Roy managed to avoid detection and capture. It's speculated that his mother more than likely helped him for the 2 fortnights. In 1943, he was once again sentenced to 30 days in prison, after which he had to spend time in a psychiatric hospital again, where he was diagnosed as having no moral sense and a danger to society. He was once again sentenced to 2 years in prison, and it was during this period that he decided to learn everything about being a butler. He had noticed that his mother, who had been working as a housekeeper in houses of wealthy people, had access to valuables, and as a butler, he would also be privy to his employer's financial records. It was during this sentence that Roy befriended a man named John Wooten. He took his new friend with him to visit his mother, and John and Marion instantly decided they were a match. They would eventually run away and get married after Roy's father's death, and John would play many a part in Roy's escapades, and even helped him to escape prison once. Once released, he befriended a woman named Esther Hall, who owned an antique and jewelry store. He noticed that the strongbox in which the precious jewels were kept was seldom locked. One afternoon, he took a chance, and, when Esther was distracted with a client, he pocketed a velvet-covered box. He took the stunning ring that had a massive emerald to a jeweler in Glasgow and was told that just to make an imitation would cost him £5,000. Roy took the ring to a fence in London and managed to pocket the neat sum of £23,000 for the ring. This gave Roy an idea. He contacted John Wooten, and the two derived a plan to rob Esther of all her precious jewels. He employed an accomplice and set out to make John and the accomplice appear to be two wealthy American businessmen looking to buy pieces of silver. Roy was standing at a payphone, and as Esther showed her clients a tea set made of silver, Roy rang the shop, pretending to be a foreigner. Once again, distracted, Esther had no idea that the two men were, while she was on the phone, cleaning out her safe into a briefcase they had brought along. By the time the theft was realized, the thieves were long gone. Accounts vary about how they were caught. Some say the accomplice flipped on them. Some say that it was when Roy had the audacity to try to pawn a jewel-encrusted pendant in the shape of St. George and the Dragon back to Esther that they were caught. Whatever the reason, this heist earned him 10 years in prison. Roy had sex with both men and women, and in prison he was reported to have been very promiscuous, all the while learning more about antiques and etiquette. He was paroled in 1963, and, with forged references in hand, he continued to steal from rich households under the guise of being their trusted butler. During this time, he was married briefly and had affairs with men and women. It was after snubbing his brother Donald by not inviting him to a celebration that Roy's luck ran out. Donald wasted no time telling authorities about Roy's escapades and where to find him. As usual, he was caught quickly and was sentenced another 10 years in a prison in Suffolk. In his book, The Perfect Gentleman, under the name Roy Hall, he gives an account of one of the most ostentatious heists I have ever heard of. He hired a theatrical costume company to make an Arabic garb with accompanying headrest. He used iodine to make his face and hands darker and hired a Rolls-Royce with an entourage. He bought a magnificent 12-piece set of suitcases and tipped the porters very generously to make him appear even more wealthy. He hopped from one hotel to another and would eventually settle on the Dorchester as the perfect stage for his heist. He knew the suite had 2 rooms with a bathroom in the middle, which just happened to have 2 doors to each of the rooms. Pretending to be Sheikh Madla Medina, he asked that the resident jeweler show him his selection of jewels, because he wanted to buy a gift for his fiancée. Claiming dissatisfaction, he asked the staff to find him other jewelers, and within hours, 6 jewelers with their wares were seated in his room. He feigned indecisiveness and said he would think about this decision after a bath. Filling the room with the hot steam of the bath, he reached his hand out and asked to see the jewels again. One by one, the men passed the precious stones through the door, never realizing that Roy had already dropped the Arab garb and was emptying each of the trays in a briefcase he had hidden. By the time everyone realized something was wrong, Roy had escaped through the other door of the bathroom. After his release in 1977, he took up work as a butler for Lady Peggy Hudson. Roy tried to conduct his thievery in a safe manner, and when David Wright appeared on his doorstep with a story about killing someone accidentally during a mugging, he was immediately concerned. David had been a fellow prisoner in Parkhurst, and the two had also been lovers, but Roy never really trusted his fellow inmate. He never trusted David, but the allure of having a younger, handsome man as company appeared to be stronger, and Roy introduced David to Lady Hudson as a friend. She took a liking to the handsome young man and offered him a position of groundskeeper and handyman, which he accepted. Roy's plan was to rob Lady Hudson only once. They were no longer in her employment. David, on the other hand, was impatient and wanted to rob her immediately. As time passed, Rob began getting irritated with his companion, who had started an affair with a 16-year-old girl named Annette. David had also managed to accumulate a gambling debt, which Roy was forced to settle. While Lady Hudson was away on a trip, Roy noticed that one of his employer's rings were missing. He knew exactly who had taken it and figured out that David had given it to Annette. As Roy tried to address the issue with David, a row ensued and the two parted ways, opting to rather get drunk in their separate bedrooms alone. Roy was awoken by the sound of a gun being cocked, and if he had not moved at that moment, he would have been dead for sure. David then proceeded to hit Roy over the head with a shotgun, and then broke down sobbing and drunk, dropping to the floor. Roy was paralyzed with fear as he looked at the path the bullet had taken through the headrest of his bed and into the wall. David begged him for his forgiveness, and Roy, realizing he had to play it cool, told his friend he forgave him. They cleaned up Roy's wounds, filled up the bullet holes, and Roy stayed calm, even inviting David to go rabbit hunting with him the following day. When David went to bed, thinking that all was forgiven, Roy called his sister Violet, who completely freaked out. She tried to convince him to come to her, but Roy decided David was far too dangerous to have around. While out hunting cottontails the next day, Roy never fired a shot. When David asked him why he was not shooting at the rabbits they had encountered, he answered that he was waiting for something bigger. All the while, Roy knew how many bullets were in his friend and lover's gun, and patiently he counted as each shot rang out in the woods until he was sure the gun was empty. Roy then turned his own gun on David and shot him 3 times in the chest and once in the head. At the age of 53 years old, Roy had committed his first murder. He buried David's body in the woods, but he wanted to make sure no one would find it. He would frequently take Lady Hudson's Labrador Retriever for a walk and have her sniff around the area, and was only satisfied with his burying skills when the dog could not pick up the smell of a decaying corpse. Roy told Lady Hudson that David had left for greener pastures. On the 7th of September, 1977, the plans he had made to rob her were foiled when an anonymous caller phoned Lady Hudson and informed her about her butler's seedy past and that she was in grave danger. She confirmed this information with the police, and Roy was escorted off the property. He soon left and went back to London for his next big scheme. In London, Roy met up with an old acquaintance of his, Mary Coggle. She had been one of Roy's many lovers and accomplices, and she would be the one to introduce Roy to Michael. Michael had always been a very small-time crook, but as you will hear, his time with Roy would change all that. He managed to procure a position as butler to an 80-year-old Walter Scott Elliot and his 60-year-old wife, Dorothy. Like Lady Hudson's husband, Walter had been a member of Parliament, and he came from an aristocratic family with its roots in Scotland. The couple liked Roy, and because they were both struggling with illnesses, they felt they had made the right decision in employing him to take care of the house and of them. It's believed that Walter had begun showing signs of early onset Alzheimer's, and Dorothy was struggling with arthritis during this time. Roy had been robbing properties in the upmarket area of Knightsbridge in East London, where the Scott Elliots were living. But his goal was to rob Walter and Dorothy and retire with the loot he had stolen. The whole plan went awry on the 8th of December 1977, when Dorothy stumbled upon Roy and 39-year-old Michael as they were either planning or looking for booze in her cellar, depending on what source you believe. She had just returned from a stay from hospital and was finding it difficult to sleep. Regardless, an argument broke out, which got louder and louder, and Roy knew he was in hot water with his employer, because the two were drunk and he was not permitted to bring strangers to the property. This would be the two's first murder as accomplices. Once again, sources vary, but it seems that Roy struck her, and then either he or Michael suffocated Roy's employer, and a new plan had to be established. They carried her back to her bed, and just as they finished tucking her dead body into the covers, they heard Walter stir. Walter, who had been having problems with senility at this time of his life, was told by Roy that Dorothy had left for Scotland, and then introduced Michael as their driver. They placed Dorothy's body in the trunk of the car, intending to bury it when they arrived in Cumbria, where Roy was renting a cottage. They ended up just dumping the body in Scotland. They had been drugging Walter, and Roy convinced another accomplice, Mary Coggle, to get dressed in Dorothy's furs, jewels, and hat, and for the trip to pretend that she was Walter's wife. The poor elderly man was constantly being drugged, and hardly knew where he was half the time. Walter was treated by Roy as if he was a child, and for the first time in his life, he was the one in charge of someone with social standing. The group drove around Scotland for 6 days. They bundled the old gentleman and made their way through the countryside in Braco, Perthshire. The two tried to convince Walter to sign some checks, but by the third one, something about this task just did not feel right. He might have been full of tranquilizers, but Walter knew something was wrong. Michael and Roy decided that their hostage was becoming too much of a problem, and on a deserted rural roadside, when the elderly gentleman wanted to relieve himself on the side of the road, Michael proceeded to strangle him. Roy would later say that the old man had quite a bit of fight in him left, and after they thought they had left him for dead, they heard Walter groan. Roy took a shovel from his trunk and then proceeded to beat his employer over the head. He then stood on his former employer's throat until he was dead. They then proceeded to bury his body in the woods. The threesome returned to London, and Mary was dropped off at her place of residence, while Roy and Michael raided the flat of the elderly couple they just murdered. Mary was not discreet, and told everyone she knew about her new wealth and showed off her new fur coat. This did not sit well with Roy. Their next victim would be Mary Coggles. Since the start of their trip, the three had been bar hopping every night. To Roy, it had become very obvious that Mary's presence was becoming a problem. Not only did she not look the part of her expensive garb and jewelry, but she also constantly stroked the fur of Dorothy's coat, which irritated him. Roy knew that the coat was incriminating evidence and tried to convince Mary to get rid of it, but Mary, who had become fond of it, refused. It appears that she had become a little scared of the duo and wanted to go back to London. Roy, pretending to be indifferent, agreed to take her to the station that evening. Mary started to pack her belongings for the trip. When she joined them again with her luggage, Roy tried to strike her with a poker, but missed her head and struck her shoulder. She jumped up, but Michael tied her up, after which Roy beat her to death with the poker. They dressed her in men's clothing, wrapped her in plastic, and tossed her over a bridge. They left her at the side of the road in a stream in Middleby, Dumfries. She was discovered on Christmas Day, 1977, by a shepherd tending to his flock. Michael and Roy then set off to Cumbria, where they met up with Roy's half-brother Donald on the 13th of January, 1978. Roy still wanted to rob Lady Hudson, and the original plan was to ask John Wooten to help them. Instead, John brought Donald to the two criminals to stand in as an accomplice. Roy hated Donald, who had recently been released after serving time for pedophilia. They told Donald that they were planning a big robbery and that they wanted to include him in their plans. On the 15th of January, 1978, the three went drinking, and Roy became concerned when he saw how much Donald drank. He was deeply concerned that Donald would brag about the robbery while he was drunk. Donald was a liability, and he discussed the problem with Michael. The two decided Donald had to go. After the evening out, the three returned to the cottage to discuss the robbery of Lady Hudson. When it came to the part where they decided how to handle their hostages, if any, Donald excitedly told them that he knew of a fail-proof method of tying someone up. Roy and Michael saw their opportunity and convinced Donald to be the first person to practice on out of the three. Once tightly secured, Roy covered Donald's mouth with a cloth soaked in chloroform. It's alleged that Roy ended up pouring the entire bottle of chloroform into his brother's throat. Once they were sure Donald was dead, they covered Donald's head with a plastic bag and stripped him naked. They placed his body, now completely wrapped in plastic, in the trunk of the car and drove 3 hours to a small hotel in the north of England. Roy had insisted on them changing the number plates, because the original number plates began with 999, which he felt were unlucky. The owner of the hotel watched the two well-dressed men book in and make their way to the bar. And although there was no tangible reason for his suspicion, something about the pair just did not sit right with him. Roy's hesitation to fill in details about their car and the fact that they appeared nervous did increase the uncomfortable feeling the landlord felt. His only fear at that point was that the two strangers might skip out on their bill, but he would soon find out that the call to the police station would be the beginning of the end of a 6-month killing spree that crossed borders. The police arrived and spoke to Norman Wright, who was the owner. They ran the number plates as Roy and Michael were frolicking in the bar. Seeing that the plates did not match the vehicle, Roy and Michael were approached and asked to explain the discrepancy. Roy told officers he was borrowing the car from a relative, but the name Roy gave did not match the name on the registration, and both men were taken to the police station. During their questioning, Roy made several trips to the bathroom, destroying maps of Lady Hudson's estate and the list of fences he had with him. On his last trip, he took his chance and climbed out of the narrow window and fled into the night. As Michael was left holding the bag while Roy fled, police were starting to connect the dots, and a clear picture of the crimes of the two men was forming. Walter and Dorothy's family were concerned about them, and when police visited the flat they occupied, They found the place in disarray. Witnesses told of two men fitting Roy and Michael's description coming and going after the couple had been reported missing. Mary Kegel's body had not been found, and as a result of her unbashful recounting of her new life, police had been having their sights on the burglaries for a while. Police were surprised when they realized Roy had escaped but did not use his car. They decided to take a closer look at the content, and that is when they made the horrific discovery of Donald Hall's decomposing body wrapped in plastic. Every police officer was immediately given his description, and a massive manhunt began. When the body in the boot was discovered, Michael, who had been silent, decided to tell the whole sordid story of their robbing and killing spree. But of course, he made sure that he carried the least of the responsibility of the crime. Thinking on his feet, Roy had caught a taxi and told the driver he urgently had to go to Edinburgh because his wife had been transferred there and she was in labor. The car soon encountered a roadblock, and when Roy matched the description of the man they were looking for, they decided to phone the hospital in Edinburgh to confirm that a Mrs. Thompson, which was the name he gave, was there. After confirming there was no person in the hospital under that name, Roy was arrested and taken into custody. When he discovered Michael had already told them everything, he confessed that there was not the 4 murders, but 5 he should be charged for. He told them about the murder of David Wright and where he had buried the body. As he smoked a cigar, he told police he bragged about his crimes and told police that this was the biggest case they would ever work. He believed he was the greatest killer and robber the world had ever seen. He took the police to the bodies and never took responsibility for his crimes. He blamed society, his victims, and the prison system for his crimes. While awaiting trial, he tried to commit suicide, but failed. The two stood trial, and Michael Kittle was sentenced to a life term, of which he had to serve at least 15 years in prison. As he walked out of the court, he turned to the gallery and said, well, life begins at 40. Roy was also given a life term, but the judgment stated that Roy Hall would spend the rest of his life in prison, never to be released. Roy Hall would die in Kingston Prison at the age of 78 from a stroke. This episode was written by Misdemeanor. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters Premium. Bye for now.